My name's Sophie Mayer. I'm a film critic and I will be chairing the Q&A this evening, and I'm delighted to introduce Sabine Krayenbühl and Zeva Oelbaum, who are the directors of the film. So I'll kick things off just by asking a few questions, and I know I can already feel there's lots of questions in the room. And we will come out to you for your questions. There is a roving mic, so when you have your hand up, if you just wait for the mic to come to you so that we can hear you on stage. This is just the most intricate film. You know, you had a cast on the scale of a feature drama, you had music composed for the film, there's archival research of incredible depth, and it all just comes together so beautifully. So my first question really is, where did you start and how did it come together?
Well, the idea originated at the house of a character that was a subject of a documentary that we worked together. Zeva was the producer of that film, I was the editor. It was a film called Ahead of Time, about another very interesting woman, trailblazing woman who had spent time in the Middle East. And one day we were at her apartment and I asked her if she had heard of Gertrude Bell, because I had read the biography and traveled in the Middle East, so did Zeva, I found out. And I said, Ruth, do you know Gertrude Bell? And she said, no, I've never heard of her. And Zeva said, oh, I just read her biography. And we said, this is such an interesting, complex character made for a film. And then it took about 3 years until our schedules came together. And that was about 5 years ago when we started initially thinking in terms of a fictional project, but because we both have a documentary background, and once we started really diving into the material and into the letters, we said, no, it's got to be a documentary.
So how many people here had heard of Gertrude Bell before they came this evening? Wow. Okay. Wow. Is that an unusual percentage?
Yes.
Well done. And you, as you said, you both have a background in film, but this is the first film where you've been named as directors. So Sabine, you're very experienced.
We named ourselves.
You named yourselves. Excellent. You're a very experienced editor on documentary and some narrative features, and Zeva, you're a producer and photographer. So how tell me about naming yourselves as directors and what that meant and what the experience has been like.
Well, it has been a really, basically a fantastic experience putting everything together. And our working relationship has been wonderfully growth inspiring. And one of the reasons that there were a few reasons why we decided to leap into the project together. And it never occurred to us actually that we wouldn't direct. We knew like from day one that was our intention. But we have a very compatible aesthetic, and we knew that we loved archival footage. And and that we were very compatible temperamentally, which is of course key, because unlike some documentaries, we worked on this documentary every day, full time. This was a full-time process. And we started with Gertrude Bell's letters, her 1,600 letters that she left, and that's just to her family. And then we sort of fanned out from her letters to research the memoirs and private papers of the people that she mentioned. And then we circled back to Gertrude Bell. It was really an intensive research process for more than 3 years. We found over 500 film clips, archival footage, and Gertrude Bell left 7,000 photographs. And for me as a photographer, she was really talented, and that was very exciting to come across her panorama photographs with the enormous negatives. So it was a challenge, but it was wonderful.
I feel like the DVD extras are going to be very special.
Oh my God.
Yes.
They're going to be long.
And just to say that the DVD will in fact be out here in June the 26th, but also if you have friends who weren't able to make this screening, there are another 40 screenings around the UK, and the film will be streaming online for the UK from April the 28th. So even if you have friends who can't see it in this wonderful widescreen format, they will be able to see it online, and all that information is on the website. Just a quick plug there. So I've been writing my notes about this in my Simone de Beauvoir notebook, and of course de Beauvoir famously said that a woman is not born but made, and if there's ever someone that is true of, it's Gertrude Bell. And even having seen this film, I'm still astonished by how she was able to defy social convention at the time. And I wondered if you could say a bit about how you think she made herself into Gertrude Bell and what you learnt from that process, whether that informed how you have become directors or, just sort of outspoken women.
In terms of Gertrude Bell, I mean, in a way she was very defined by her background, growing up in a upper class family, and her background not only from a social point but also from an emotional point. She lost her mother, as you saw, at 3 years old, and early on she was always rebellious, and I think that having the constraints of the society that surrounded her really was something that she wanted to break free of, and going out and sort of being far away from home, at the same time connecting still with home on a daily level by writing letters, which then of course didn't get sent every day, but every 5 weeks or so. She really was able to distance herself from that and find who she was and come into her own. And it occurred to her the first time when she was out in the when she started her first travels in the Middle East, that people were looking at her outside the context of her background and seeing her as this obviously still exotic person, not being one of them, but they related to her and she related to them in a very natural way, and she found that extremely gratifying, and I think that helped giving her a certain confidence in herself.
I also think that she was really affected by her close relationship with her father. We have come across this time and time again, is she felt just as entitled as anyone else, including any man, to do anything she wanted. There was that sort of inherent confidence, but also why would the world be anything but that way? Her expectation, and may have been partly formed by her relationships.
Thank you. And I won't say too much about this, but obviously there has also been a feature film made about Gertrude Bell, which we'll pretend it doesn't exist, and we're very glad that you've beaten it to UK screens with the real story. But there was another, so that's a film by Werner Herzog, but Ridley Scott was also hoping to make a Gertrude Bell biography. There's an enormous amount of interest in her at the moment, and obviously there's a contemporary resonances and echoes, implications of her, what she was involved in terms of the sort of the colonial process in the Middle East. Was that something that you were thinking about while you were making the film, in terms of the contemporary political resonances, or something that just sort of grew in your intention?
Yes, one of the reasons that the film seemed so intriguing to us, beyond Gertrude Bell and how complex she was and how interesting a character she was the parallels that we saw between the 1917 British occupation and the 2003 American invasion. And when we started the film in 2012, Iraq was off the headlines, at least in the United States. We had pulled out. It was not a country of as much day-to-day interest and media coverage. So that we were looking backwards to 2003. Tragically, of course, now it's back in the headlines for some very tragic reasons, and the film has contemporary relevance of a lot of different strands and reasons.
The fact, the discovery of these parallels to 2003 was also one of the reasons that we decided that we didn't really want to go the, let's say, more conventional road of a documentary, a historical documentary, by interviewing experts and, historians, archaeologists that would be looking back and making analytical statements about this. But we really felt that that war had been covered in so much around the world that people would come to see the film and be able to draw their own parallels and discover the fact that history really repeats itself in a way that is quite stunning.
And one of the most sort of immediate ways that you bring it to life, rather than making it a historical documentary, is obviously the voice of Tilda Swinton, who in fact played a version of Vita Sackville-West in Sally vs. Orlando. So she has this kind of patrician history of playing such roles, but also she is from a military family. And I'm just obviously curious about how you pitched her the project and what her feelings about it were. What did she know about Gertrude Bell, and how was it working with her?
Well, it was very interesting that we were able to approach her directly through Thelma Schoonmaker, one of our executive producers, and she had actually been cast as Gertrude Bell 10 years ago. But that project didn't happen because the screenwriter died, unfortunately, and the director died, unfortunately, and so that project just disappeared. So she was intrigued and interested, actually, when we were able to approach her, and that's really what made it happen, because she is so in demand, obviously, and so busy. Her interest allowed us to book her, and she was wonderful to work with. Very collaborative. Worked with this on the accent, how she should sound. We loved it.
I read a review today that suggested you could also have an audiobook with Tilda reading the letters, so another life of the documentary. I want to throw it open to the audience at the moment, right now. As I say, there is a mic, so I'm wondering, are there questions? Immediately, one down here. Great, fantastic.
Okay, let's pretend that the Werner Herzog film does exist. How did the fact they knew that the Werner Herzog was making a film, presumably at some point when you were making your film, affect the making of your film? And now that both are available, how do you think they complement each other? What does one have that the other doesn't, and so?
Well, neither of us has seen the Herzog film completely. We saw parts of it and we read about a lot. We followed it closely. It was interesting, really, when we had our idea and decided to move forward. Within 3 months of us getting together and writing, I think first Ridley Scott came out and then Herzog, and of course we were immediately signing on to Google Alert so that we know what's happening. But it was interesting because that the film was shown in Berlin in 2015, and the main criticism and what we have heard and seen parts of is that it focuses solely on Gertrude Bell's romantic life. In fact, she never goes to Iraq in Herzog's film.
Never.
And so we...
I'm sorry, what? Can you just say that bit again?
Yes. Supposedly. We can't confirm it because we haven't seen it all the way, but that's what we've read. And the critics were saying, we wish there would be a documentary about Gertrude Bell. So in a way, it is, we were always afraid that it would maybe blow our film, away because it's a huge, gigantic project with, headline actors and famous Hollywood stars. But in a way, I think we are certainly adding, complementing, and hopefully giving a lot more to an audience with our project.
Any other questions? We'll just give Josh a bit of a workout. So one.
Thank you. I love the film. I was really intrigued about the archival footage that you had. Can you speak to us a little bit about your sources?
Sure. The archival footage, that was really our first challenge, was wondering if we were going to find enough archival footage for a full-length film, because of course we were completely dependent on finding 100-year-old footage from the Middle East. And we were very fortunate that because it was the dawn of cinema, and people looked to this new way of documentation. People actually did go out. They fanned out, particularly Egypt. Egypt was very easy to find. Persia, Damascus. For World War I, we are quite thankful for the Imperial War Museum, who did a remarkable job in 35 millimeter of documenting Baghdad, and most of the footage you saw of Baghdad was from Imperial War Museum. The very first phone call that we made when we were first putting our heads together to do the film was to an unlikely source, the University of South Carolina, which has the outtakes of the movie-tone newsreels. And that footage that you see at the very beginning of the film, with the round boats that are called guffas, and the men unloading the big crates at the docks, that's from University of South Carolina. And that was literally the first clip we had gotten, and we thought, well, we better keep on with this project. So we ended up looking through 25, our sources are 25 different archives from all over the world. And it was great, wonderful experience.
Such an incredible labor of love.
It was so fun because it was
like a treasure hunt.
Yes,
Yeah.
We never knew what we were going to find. And some of the footage, as you saw, is hand tinted. It's all original.
Some of it had never been scanned before. We were just going by keywords and got written material back from the archives that sort of lined up with what we were looking for, and then we sent our poor executive producer into the vault of the Library of Congress, and she had to put on this heavy coat to protect her from the sub-zero temperatures. And she really literally went and manually pulled the negative apart, looked at it, and found some of the footage that we had identified on the paper. So and that had never been digitized before.
I think Gertrude Bell would appreciate that as an adventure. She would have worn a ski jacket, of course.
Yes.
There was a question down here.
Thank you. I've got two questions, one short and one a little bit longer. Do you know what happened to the artifacts in the museum that she was curating after 2003? That was the first question.
Yes, in fact, one of our advisors is Lami Al-Galyani, who is an expert on the museum and is currently writing a book about it. And she told us that the museum contained a lot of very small artifacts, cylinder seals. In fact, had a huge collection of cylinder seals, and those are for the most part lost. But some of the other bigger objects have been returned. One of the museum had originally a bust of Gertrude Bell that unfortunately has been lost. But it has opened again, and it's open to the public, and it's functioning as a regular museum again.
And the second question is, I wondered if you felt that maybe in a strange way she was at an advantage being a woman, because with people like Faisal, he wouldn't have felt the same if it had been a sort of white male representative of the British government, but a woman he might possibly have relaxed more with.
Well, we did find that we do think that that made a difference, particularly in the desert with the sheikhs in the desert, or a lot of the different people that Gertrude Bell interacted with. She caught people off guard, and you know, because she was strode in with her hat and her parasol and you know, her English everything, and. We do think that might have been a part of it, that people loosened up and that the men became a tiny bit more relaxed, perhaps in part because they weren't intimidated by her or weren't wary of her. She was able to sort of slip underneath that natural wariness. And then, of course, she established relationships with women, which the men could not do. So we do think it was an advantage.
These are all fantastic questions. Is there maybe one more?
Just one.
Yes. Oh, perfect.
She must have been an amazing linguist, and I wondered whether you found any recordings of her voice.
Very interesting question. Unfortunately we never did.
Sure.
But when we showed initially, there was a Gertrude Bell conference organized by one of our partners, the British Institute for the Study of Iraq, which is actually known as the Gertrude Bell Memorial formally. We showed some clips, and we had at that time, we used a friend of ours to do the voice, just because we were just in the initial stages and we were using this temporary voice on, and immediately one of the first big discussions was, how did Gertrude Bell sound like? What kind of accent must she have had? Did she speak Oxford English? Did she have a northern accent? And it erupted into this huge discussion, and her in several of her contemporaries have described her sometimes as this shrill voice that was yelling out from the water, where she was almost drowning, or but of course, all of that considered, we were making a film that it was going to be 90 minutes, and we wanted to find a voice that was pleasant to listen to, that was expressive, and that would not annoy for 90 minutes.
Have you, or will you have, do you hope, the opportunity to show the film in Baghdad or to Iraqi diaspora audiences?
Yes, we've had the very good luck to have been able to show the film to Iraqis, including the Iraqi ambassador to the Netherlands, who attended our screening in IDFA in Amsterdam, and he was very taken with the film and wants to help us arrange to screen it at The Hague, and also introduced us to the Iraqi ambassador to the United States, who saw the film, and we recently, a few weeks ago, screened at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and he spoke for a few minutes after the film. And he also loves the film, and there are definite rumblings of trying to figure out how we can screen it in Baghdad. We screened the film actually yesterday at the Royal United Services Institute, which is diplomats and government people, and they were also percolating, like, how can we get this in Baghdad? We would love that.
Also, a few of our, we had several Iraqi advisors on the film, and they are all also really putting their heads together, because initially we were going to go back to help with an archive that came to our attention, a film archive in Iraq that was also heavily destroyed in 2003, and so in conjunction with that there was, you know, showing the film possibly, but then the government changes and it's a whole, you have to start from scratch again trying to get there. So, but we are definitely, it's on our radar list very high up.
Great. So New York in June, and then maybe Baghdad thereafter.
But not in July.
No,
not in July.
I want to say shukran to Sabine and Zeva,
Yes.
and to all of you for coming to the film and staying, for excellent questions. Do tell friends and family about it, all the places they can find it, and keep an eye out for the DVD, because it may have some more ways to explore. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.